Hi there. My name is Alexis Wolf, and with my partner Shannon Zarrett and the rest of the Bioenergy Is Not team, we'd like to thank you for joining us today to learn more about the basics of biomass and bioenergy. The purpose of this webinar is to provide some general background about bioenergy, its creation, and its potential uses. We'll go through some of the definitions involved in bioenergy and take you through the types of feedstocks that are used for bioenergy and the basic products that are made up of biomass. Then we'll take you step by step through the biomass to biofuels life cycle and show you what it exactly takes to make recently living plant matter into an energy product. We'll then highlight some of the important aspects of bioenergy and the context of bioenergy within our current U.S. energy landscape. Finally, we'll discuss why the Department of Energy is emphasizing research and development into this important technology. If you have any questions or would like to know more about the basics of biomass or bioenergy, please feel free to reach out to the Operation Bioenergy Is Not team at the email listed on the screen, or bioenergizeme@ee.doe.gov. If you're looking for more resources on bioenergy or biomass, please visit the Education and Workforce Development website on the link that's provided on the screen, or energy.gov/eere/bioenergy/education-and-workforce-development, which is also listed on the screen. You can find this webinar, as well as other Operation Bioenergy Is Not webinar recordings and slides, at the Bioenergy Technologies Office website, which is listed on the screen. So let's jump right in and talk about biomass and bioenergy. Biomass is the organic material that has stored sunlight in the form of chemical energy. Sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, and convert it plants can be thought of as warehouses for solar energy. Through photosynthesis, plants collect sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water and convert it into chemical energy in the form of sugars that are stored in their biomass. One type of sugar that's created by biomass is called cellulose, which we will talk about in a little bit. Bioenergy is a form of renewable energy derived from biomass to create heat and electricity, also known as biopower, biofuels, which are transportation fuels, biochemicals, and other energy-related bioproducts that are produced from biomass. Bioenergy is energy that is produced from renewable biomass resources. However, bioenergy does not include solar, wind, water, geothermal, or nuclear energy. Bioenergy also does not include non-renewable fossil energy resources like coal, oil, or natural gas. Biomass that is used for bioenergy production is called a feedstock. There are many different types of feedstocks that can be utilized for bioenergy. For example, the biofuel ethanol, which is made from corn, represents the first generation of biofuels. The Department of Energy is focusing on new technologies to make biofuels and bioenergy from many non-food sources, such as corn cobs and stalks, also called corn stover, woody byproducts, municipal waste, and algae. Ethanol that is produced from cellulose and non-food sources is called cellulosic ethanol. Cellulosic ethanol and bioenergy made from non-food sources are the part of the next generation of bioenergy. The 5 different types of sustainable feedstocks that are primarily used for next-generation bioenergy production include agricultural residues, forest residues, energy crops, algae, and municipal solid waste. Agricultural residues are plant parts left in the field after harvest. This plant matter and secondary residues like manure and food processing waste can be useful feedstocks. Agricultural residues are plant parts left in the field after harvest, which we already talked about. But then forest residues are leftover wood or plant material from logging operations, forestry management, and land clearing. Secondary residues like mill waste supplement this category. As well, energy crops are fast-growing trees and perennial grasses that are specifically grown for energy uses. Trees and perennial grasses can often be grown on land that is less suitable for conventional crops and can stabilize the soil. Municipal solid waste, such as dead leaves, food scraps, and other garbage thrown out, has the potential to also be a bioenergy feedstock. And last but not least, many macroalgae, microalgae, or tiny algae, and cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae, carry out photosynthesis to drive rapid biomass growth. Algae biomass can contain really high levels of oil, making it a promising feedstock for biofuels, including renewable gasoline. Okay, so let's take you back to Biology 101, probably one of the very first sections, if you guys are familiar with, where you covered macromolecules. So essentially what we're trying to get at in the biomass are these high-value macromolecules, specifically carbohydrates and lipids. And what's really important about these macromolecules are the bonds between them hold tremendous energy potential. So when we talk about plant material, we're talking about different carbohydrates, which vary from simple sugars all the way to your larger polysaccharides that contain individual long chains of individual sugar units bonded together. So your starches and your cellulose, okay? So right now, the current ethanol that's on the market is mostly made out of these simple sugars. Lipids are another class of macromolecules. Those are your oils and your fats. And those are a little bit more energy dense. So they can be used for biodiesel, so for larger trucks and vehicles. Proteins are another class that are incredibly important to us. So they can actually be converted into bio-based products, separate from transportation fuel. And enzymes, which are a class of proteins, are actually very useful to the process of obtaining carbohydrates and lipids because they can help us catalyze reactions and break down these larger polysaccharides and larger fat molecules. So let's talk about one macromolecule in particular that's of great interest to the bioenergy industry, and that's cellulose. It is the most abundant organic terrestrial polymer on the planet, and it is the main component of plant cell walls. And essentially it's made from individual glucose sugar molecules. And you can really think of cellulose as the steel beams of the plant cell wall, really holding it together. And this is an incredibly powerful macromolecule and one of the most important macromolecules that we're trying to access and break down into individual sugar units. And we'll kind of talk about what does that exactly mean? What are we meaning when we're trying to get at the sugar units? So let's look at the life cycle. So very simply, how are we turning biomass into bioenergy? So we start at the feedstock, the raw material. We transport that raw material to a biorefinery where it is converted into a high-value fuel product. And then we can take that product, distribute it, until it finally gets to the end user, so you can use in your vehicles. So the first part of the process, feedstock supply and transport. So here we have renewable biomass that's harvested, basically breaking it down into smaller pieces so it's easier to carry, rolling it into bales. And then we process that biomass, transporting it to a storage site or eventually a biorefinery. Okay, so here's an example of a potential feedstock to a biorefinery pathway. So when you're looking at this, it's important to note that bioenergy only uses purpose-grown woody crops. I know we're showing trees here. These are woody residues that cannot be used to make lumber or other wood-based products such as forest thinnings, tree limbs, and tree tops. So they're really an underutilized resource at this point. They're not being utilized. So picture this. Say I own and manage some land in Virginia where I grow oak trees. And these are used to make lumber, as well as fast-growing dedicated woody biomass, poplar, and southern pine. And I can contract a logging company to come in and cut down the trees and then take the wood to make lumber. However, there's a lot that's still left over in the process of collecting the lumber. There's a lot of tree branches, limbs, stumps, and treetops that right now, have no use. And so that's where bioenergy can come in. I can harvest and process those leftover parts of the trees as well as the dedicated woody trees that I grow. such as what's shown on the slide. Standing poplar and southern pine trees that are felled by machines and placed in a pile in a process called yarding. The piled trees, as well as the leftover tree limbs, stumps, and treetops, are then delimbed and debarked with a grappling machine, and then broken down into small pieces by passing through the chipper. These smaller chip pieces allow for easier transport to the biorefineries. After the chipped woody biomass arrives at the biorefinery, it is stored until it's ready to process. The biomass is dried in larger dryers so that it can be converted into fuels and products. So this pre-processing step is very important. We really essentially want to get it broken down into smaller, easy-to-use particles. Okay, so currently this is a very kind of simplistic look at what goes on in the biorefinery, and we're kind of going to get into this a little bit deeper in a minute. So essentially, we've got the biomass that has been pre-processed. It's easier to work with. It's in smaller components. And essentially, we want to treat that with chemicals. We call this a pre-treatment step, either with extreme heat, acid, or a salt solution. We want to get something in there that can break up the cell wall structure. So that's the first step. We want to break apart the cell wall structure because it's really tough. Then enzymes break down cellulose into sugar units, individual sugar units. Then microbes can ferment that sugar into ethanol, and then the ethanol undergoes distillation. It's purified and prepared for distribution. So this is sort of a standard cellulosic biorefinery, but as you can see in a couple more slides, we actually have some additional ways to convert biomass into finished fuel products. Okay, so breaking it down, we actually have two pathways. It can get a little bit more confusing, but for simplicity's sake, it's easier to say we break down biomass in either one of two ways, with extreme heat and pressure, or with biological organisms and chemical catalysts. Okay, so we can think of it thermochemical versus biochemical. Now, the way that we have described this is low temperature conversion versus high temperature conversion. So essentially, low temperature conversion follows a very similar pathway to what I had described before. So the biomass undergoes what's called a pre-treatment step. And as you can see from the picture up there, what we want to do is break down the tough structure of a plant cell wall. So the plant cell wall is a combination of lignin, which is not a polysaccharide. It's a very complex molecule in and of itself. Hemicellulose, which is a polysaccharide, and cellulose, another polysaccharide. And they're all entangled together in this really tough knot. And what we really need to do is break apart that knot. So we essentially treat the plant material with either using heat, an acid, liquid salt solution. We want to break those up and make all of those larger, longer molecules, specifically the polysaccharides, more accessible. Okay, so you can kind of see in that visual right there, we're breaking it apart. We're trying to break all these little pieces apart. So it's a nice untangled mess. Then we can take the polysaccharides, the cellulose and the hemicellulose, and we want to get at the individual sugar units. So we use enzymes, that special class of proteins, and those enzymes split those big, large molecules into smaller sugar subunits. It's easier for us to work with the sugar that way. One enzyme that we use in particular is cellulase. Cleaves those tight bonds, and now you're left with sugar. So then there are a variety of microbes that can actually ferment sugar. So basically they consume the sugar, and as a byproduct of their metabolism, as a byproduct of them consuming it, they produce what we call ethanol. And we can also engineer microbes to produce renewable hydrocarbon fuels. You know, these are fuels that are chemically equivalent to gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Okay, so the microbes ferment that sugar either into an ethanol, okay, and we'll talk about exactly what ethanol is in a little bit, or renewable gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Okay, and we get our finished fuel product. Then we have the high temperature conversion. Okay, so basically we've got our pre-processed biomass, we've got smaller pellets of it.
So essentially, there are 3 different processes for various different reasons: pyrolysis, gasification, and hydrothermal liquefaction. Okay? And all 3 of these processes use extreme heat and pressure to basically break down the biomass either into a gaseous or a liquid byproduct, or intermediate in this case. Hydrothermal liquefaction is generally best used for wet feedstock. So when we talk about algae, we're usually talking about hydrothermal liquefaction. So that's, heat and pressure in the presence of water as well. Pyrolysis typically yields a bio-oil. So we heat that to a certain extent, and then we let the gas basically condense down into a bio-oil. In gasification, obviously the gaseous intermediate, we call that a syngas. So you've either got a bio-oil or a synthesis gas as your intermediate. Okay? Then, unfortunately, those intermediates are not ready for the gas pump. They're still got a lot of chemicals in that mixture that really need to come out. It's not quite compatible yet. So what we can do is these intermediates will undergo an upgrading step, probably several upgrading steps using different chemicals. And essentially what we're trying to do is remove all of those unwanted materials. We don't want those in there. And basically chemically build a very strong molecule that we'll be able to put in our gas tanks easily, and that will be compatible with existing infrastructure. So deconstruct the biomass into a gas or a liquid intermediate, and then chemically upgrade it into a finished fuel product that is compatible with existing infrastructure. Okay, and then lastly, once the product is finished and once we've got it to a point where it could work very well or easily with current infrastructure, we then distribute it to its final end use, which could either be, like we had said, aviation, heavy trucks, diesel-like engines, and then, of course, gasoline, so your standard cars on the road.
So we've talked a lot about advanced biofuels, or bioenergy making advanced biofuels, but it's important to know that bioenergy can create things other than fuels as well, such as electricity, which is also called biopower, bioproducts, which include plastics, cleaning agents, chemicals, food additives, nutraceuticals, things that go in your cosmetics, pretty much anything that plant materials can be made out of, as well as creating heat and steam that we can use in our home. So we first wanted to talk about, what are some of the type of vehicles that you can actually put biofuels in. So we can put them in buses, larger trucks, actual personal vehicles, big, large construction vehicles, boats, planes, and regular trucks. So biofuels are the end product when biomass is converted directly into a liquid fuel. The most common types of biofuels that are used today are ethanol and biodiesel. Ethanol is an alcohol that is made by fermenting the sugar components of biomass, so similar to the process that we talked about before. Ethanol is now actually used as a fuel additive for cars at a 10% blend, further reducing our need for oil imports. It's also blended in gasoline as an oxygenate to increase octane and improve vehicle emissions. Another type of ethanol that is used today is called E85, which is an 85% ethanol blend with regular petroleum, so 15% petroleum blend. It can be used in a vehicle called a flexible fuel vehicle. And these flexible fuel vehicles are designed to tolerate the fuel's high ethanol content in a standard gasoline as well, interchangeably. So you could put E85 in your gas tank with a flex fuel vehicle, or you could put regular gasoline in your gas tank. Another type of biofuel that we can create is renewable hydrocarbon fuels. So renewable hydrocarbon fuels are compounds that are composed primarily containing hydrogen and renewable and carbon atoms. So examples of renewable hydrocarbon fuels include renewable gasoline, jet fuels, and diesel fuels. So when we talk about renewable gasoline, we're talking about renewable hydrocarbon fuels. We're talking about drop-in fuels, which is means that they are compatible with existing cars and trucks and jets and infrastructure that we already have, and can serve as a direct placement for petroleum-derived gasoline, jet fuels, and diesel fuel. So we wouldn't have to go change all the cars that are out on the roads today with a drop-in fuel. The last one that I wanted to talk about was biodiesel. So biodiesel is a mixture of fatty acids made from like vegetable oils, animal fats, recycled greases, and even algae. So biodiesel can be used as a fuel for vehicles in its pure form, but it's usually used as a petroleum diesel additive to reduce levels of particulates or little particles in the air, such as sulfates, as well as carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, and air toxics that are usually emitted from diesel-powered vehicles. So renewable diesel is a really good alternative to petroleum-based diesel. And it's chemically similar to what you would already get from a diesel pump, but it releases lower emissions out of all the diesel blends that are out there. So moving on to products that are made from biomass. Today, conventionally, petroleum is refined to make chemical feedstocks that are used in thousands of products that we use every day. Many of these feedstocks that are made from petroleum could actually be replaced with value-added chemicals that are produced from biomass to manufacture clothing, plastics, lubricants, and other products. For example, you might have seen a plastic bottles that have a little plant symbol on them. That means they have been made from a biomass source. The emerging U.S. bio-based products industry combines expertise and technology from agriculture, forest products, and chemical industries to create these new plastics and chemicals and composite materials from renewable resources. They often require less energy to produce and produce fewer greenhouse gas emissions than petroleum-based equivalents. So another added bonus to bioproducts is that they add value to biofuel production, improving the economics of biorefinery operations and making those biofuels more cost competitive, or cheaper for the consumer and cheaper for producers to make. So we wanted to also briefly touch on biopower, which is where we convert, or where biomass is converted into heat and electricity using a similar process that we do with fossil fuels. So one of the key attributes of biomass is that it can be available upon demand. The energy is stored within the biomass until it's needed, whereas for other forms of renewable energy, are dependent on variable environmental conditions, such as wind power being dependent on wind speed, and solar power dependent on sunlight intensity. So until several decades ago in the United States, biomass was actually primarily used to provide heat for cooking and comfort. And technologies that can generate electricity from the energy in biomass fuels have since been developed. The scale is actually small enough to be used on a farm or in a remote village, and it could also be scaled up large enough to provide power for a large city.
Okay. Now that we've gone into the different end uses for biomass, let's look a little bit about where we currently are with bioenergy in the United States. So all things need energy. Every sector needs energy, and there are two general classes, ways to classify this type of energy. So there are renewable sources. It's an energy source that can be easily replenished by the environment on a relatively short time scale. And then you have non-renewable resources. That's an energy source that cannot be easily recreated, especially on a human time scale. So if we take a little look at the current energy consumption by source, and even though this is from 2014, it still provides you a good sort of snapshot with where the industry is right now. So renewable energy accounts for 10% of the total, and non-renewable, of course, is the rest. But what's interesting about the renewable energy sector is that 50% of that renewable energy is supplied by biomass resources. So they make a significant part of that total. Okay, so why are we talking about bioenergy? Why right now? And this goes into, a larger topic of energy literacy, which we have other webinars which address that. But bioenergy, the way that we use bioenergy has changed dramatically over time, and we have really developed quite a few sophisticated methods to harness those macromolecules in biomass. And bioenergy is a crucial part of America's all-of-the-above strategy. It's an important component that we are looking to meet America's energy needs. Okay, so it's one of the very many renewable energy resources, but it's quite unique, and I'll kind of talk about that in 2 seconds. It's a little bit unique when we talk about compared to wind and solar. So it's important for people to understand these basic energy principles, different energy resources, and the different technology options available, specifically the benefits and challenges of various energy resources. So if you look at something like bioenergy, what's unique about it is it's one of the probably the only energy resource that could offer a viable substitute for petroleum-based liquid fuels, at least in the near term. And especially when you're looking at industries like, aviation or ships, sort of these larger vehicles where electrification would be a lot more challenging, you could see that bioenergy would play a very significant role and be very useful for those types of industries. So understanding each energy resource and the benefits of each is very important, and for students and their peers to be able to understand that they can play an important role in shaping America's energy future as well. Okay, so now on to the bio benefits. We've talked a lot about, different resources, how they're converted into end-use products, kind of where we are, a little snapshot on bioenergy in the US. But let's talk about the benefits of bioenergy. So if we look at an economic, social, and environmental standpoint, as an example, we saw how many end-use markets. We've got power, products, fuels, and these will no doubt open doors for a variety of different industries, creating jobs, rural development, workforce training. In addition to that, having a nice, domestic resource here will help with energy security, lower, imports of petroleum. And lastly, environmental sustainability. So bioenergy can be cultivated sustainably, and there are actually a number of feedstocks that can maintain, if not improve, environmental services. So for example, certain energy crops can actually help reduce nutrient runoff. They can help store soil carbon. They can even provide a variety of habitat for a variety of wildlife. So there's a number of benefits that are associated with the use of bioenergy, and leaders are helping to determine how we can plan for the industry to expand in a way that meets these 3 pillars of sustainability. Okay, so the idea of the bioeconomy is one in which we have a sector of the U.S. economy that relies on bio-based products. And in general, this is kind of a good depiction of the potential of the bioeconomy. So if we look, we have the potential to create 1.1 million direct jobs. It's about 250 billion in the U.S., okay? 85 billion kilowatts of electricity to power 6 million households, plus 1,050 trillion BTUs of thermal energy, 50 billion gallons of biofuels, displacing almost 25% of all transportation fuels, 50 billion pounds of bio-based chemicals and bioproducts, replacing a significant portion of the chemical market, and 400 million tons of CO2 equivalent reductions every year. So this is the potential for biomass in the United States.
And with that, that's a wrap. So thank you so much for joining us today for Biomass Basics webinar. If you want to test your knowledge of biomass and bioenergy that you learned today, check out our Bioenergy 101 quiz, which can be played in the classroom and is a really fun game to use. If you're curious to learn more about bioenergy, please visit the Bioenergy Technology Office's website or the Bioenergy Education and Workforce Development site. And as always, email the Bioenergize Me team if you have any questions or want to know more about education and workforce development activities in bioenergy. We'll see you next time.